There we go. All right, welcome everyone to our first official Boardwalk talk where we explore all different topics. We have 8 or so already actually planned behind the scenes. And they're what some might consider controversial topics. And we are, and Maeve says it better than I, we are not here to be negative on any topic. We're just exploring why something is so controversial. So we look at all sides. So today's is, why is GMO always the villain and organic always the hero? Maybe
Sure, yeah. So these talks are not to go through a lot of data points. The point is not to present only one opinion that we both agree with. And I would say that for all of these Boardwalk talks, these are literally just going to be Susie and I discussing this issue and kind of getting some thoughts started on our end and on your end. You might not agree with us. Frankly, in other talks, we probably won't agree with each other. But it's really just an opportunity for us as industry professionals to get together and chat about these issues because they are going to be relevant going forward and present both opportunities and challenges. Susie, anything else you want to add to that?
No, I think you captured it perfectly. Again, they're controversial. We're not here to grandstand on either side, but
Right.
We are going to be looking at different angles at all the topics we're going to be bringing up.
Right. And they are all of these are going to be complicated issues, and there is going to be no one solution or answer for any one operator or manufacturer who might be joining us on the call. So it's really just to get you potentially thinking about the issues in a different way to hopefully approach them in the best possible long-term strategic way for your organization, whatever that means for you.
Exactly, because these are topics that you may have to address with whoever your clients are.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we can probably, dive right on in. So I don't know how many of you have seen this. I'm assuming probably everybody on the call is familiar with this, but we thought the GMO issue was timely given that a few months ago, when was that, Susie? Was it June, July, August?
Yeah.
They introduced that they were going to be releasing, or it was approved, this purple tomato. And what I thought was very interesting about the announcement was that it wasn't presented as a hybridized tomato or something that was being presented to the press as anything other than an approved GMO tomato. So Susie, you were going to look up to see if there were any specific benefits to this other than its gorgeous color.
Yeah, and it does carry higher certain vitamin levels. And what caused me to be interested in the purple tomato is that I garden, and so I grow tomatoes. And one of my favorite tomatoes is an heirloom tomato, and it's literally called the Cherokee Purple, and it's purple. So there are already purple tomatoes that have been hybridized, in the past, and this one is an heirloom tomato. So that the brand new purple tomato, that's why we were curious. It's like, well, what's so different about it? But what was funny that captured our attention is that the headlines captured that it's GMO. It didn't capture the benefits of the tomato. It didn't capture, well, why was it created? It just splashed the headline GMO. And that's what got us to thinking about having this talk, is like that was the capture, but they didn't go into really at all the benefits of why it was even created in the first place. And that's a problem we find with many GMO products is, as you put it, Maeve, the headlines get centered on what a company is doing or how the fertilizers work, but they're not capturing the benefit or the reason behind the creation of the product in the first place.
Right. So if you go to the next slide, Susie, so that got us talking about the fact that in all conversations, it seems to be pitting the idea of organic food against the idea of GMO food. And Susie, you said it best earlier today that they're really not apples to apples. We're not talking about arguably an even comparison.
They're not, and yet they get pitted against each other all the time in the media and with consumers, and even when you go to conferences. But they're not the same. They're not on the same wavelength at all. They're on two, as you put it, they're on two different ends of this spectrum of ethics and morality and philosophy and transparency. That's how they're related, but they're not, there's no physical connection between these two topics, but they keep coming up, as adversaries to each other. And it's so odd because scientifically they're not. Organics, you're mostly talking about like growing techniques, et cetera. And GMO is not. GMO is a science of how a crop is created.
Right.
And so they're two things.
Right. And arguably, right, GMOs are, when you're talking about creating something like the purple tomato, GMOs are arguably nothing more than the act of hybridizing, which of course has been going on for well over 100 years. The act of hybridizing or human intervention in the creation of new varieties. GMO just speeds up that process, right? Hybridization has been happening where humans have been picking and choosing the attributes that they want in crops, but had to do it prior to the advent of GMO technology, very slowly, trial and error, to eventually get to what they want. GMO simply exacted that science when you're talking about nothing more than creating a varietal. And like Susie said, it's not so much that they truly exist on a real spectrum, if you will, of good versus bad, or this side versus the other side. But I do think that the way the media has positioned these issues and the way that consumers, particularly those that are highly engaged and committed to the idea of organics, have ethically placed them on a spectrum of good versus bad, this versus that, when really I don't think that they are. And I think, Susie, if you go to the next slide, that got us talking about, should this conversation actually be about organics versus GMOs, and should they really be pitted against each other? And we're going to talk about why they shouldn't really. But the more the two of us started talking about this, it really became more of a communication issue, and not just from the media and not just consumers and how they're seeking information. All of that comes into play. But I think that it's as much how our industry communicates, either directly or indirectly, and we'll get into that, what is or is not good, and the position that our industry is essentially taking on these different issues. Wouldn't you say, Susie?
Yeah, because right now organic and GMO is set up in a classic victim, villain, hero play. Victim is the consumer and villain is GMO typically, and hero is organic. But that's actually that's not the real story. That's a story between consumers and media have created. And it got created falsely, out of communication errors. So it's set up this fantastical trilogy of victim, villain, and hero, but that's not actually what we're talking about here. And what we don't want to go down that path, and we don't think industry should stay on that path if that's how you're talking about the topics either.
Right. And so the reason we think that they really should not be on opposite sides of any spectrum is, as we think about what our industry and what the world is going to have to be dealing with as climate changes, as the population increases, as we undoubtedly end up dealing with future pandemics of various sizes, and the issues that will bring up with regard to human health, there's almost no way that GMOs will not come into play in that. If you think about having to grow crops with a great deal less water, with hostile growing conditions, with greater heat, more sun, longer days, whatever that ends up being, or even on the opposite side, colder, right? Harsher temperatures, bigger swings. So they really will exist. I mean, GMOs will be helping to solve for a lot of these issues in order to address global hunger, food deserts, more affordable crops.
Yeah, I mean, that's why Africa just recently announced it's opening its doors to new GMOs being grown, new GMOs coming into the countries. And 20 years ago, there was a big news story around one of the African countries had shut its borders and let barges of different crops sit just rotting because they wouldn't let it in the country. And now they're growing GMO. They're allowing GMO. There are Asian nations now who are anti-GMO and now allowing GMO in, right? And so we're the one, first world country who's kind of like, think we have the luxury to reject or embrace it, but you have countries who need these crops to get parts of the nation out of starvation. They don't have the luxury. That's why the governments are opening the doors now.
Right. And it, on the opposite side, it's actually very interesting that this consumer driven and media to some degree driven perception that GMOs are essentially in some way bad, right? Either bad for you, bad for the environment, just bad on a number of different levels is very interesting, given that we are also at this period of time where we're actively discussing the reality of cellular agriculture, of meat products being developed without animals being involved, or at least the cells of the animals being involved, and these being grown in labs. We've got plant-based alternatives that are highly processed options that are largely lab-based, that have been broadly embraced by a range of consumers. And I would argue probably consumers who are anti-GMO have felt comfortable, trying a number of these products. So it is really interesting that we continue to have this, are they or aren't they for GMOs good or bad? And yet on the flip side, we've also got these highly tech-driven potential solutions to a number of different problems. So the dichotomy, or the dichotomy of this discussion, or kind of the hypocrisy to a certain degree, is very interesting given the point of time we're in.
Yeah, especially since consumers went through the phase of being on board with faux meats, yet faux meats have soy that's GMO, and there are 38 ingredients to the deck. And somehow they believe that's sustainable, yet research has come out showing those products are not going to change the world. They're not going to help sustainability in any meaningful way, right? So now consumers are walking away from some of those products. Yet they'll stand up against GMO. I'm like, you're eating GMO right now. Like, you've been eating GMOs between corn, soybeans, et cetera, for well over 20 years. And the Obama administration, I mean, this has already been known, but FDA has never been anti-GMO. USDA has never been anti-GMO. That's why the legislation is written where you can label something does not contain GMO, but you cannot label it contains GMO, because the only reason you label something contains GMO, is because it is a danger. That's why allergen labeling contains wheat, soy, et cetera, because it's an allergen. There's an issue. You can't label that with GMO because there is no issue. And so that's why the Obama administration had come forward, verbalizing, saying that, just so you understand, there is no problem. And FDA right now, they are late to the game with doing this, but they're actually starting a whole educational initiative to educate consumers in this country on the safety and the benefits of GMO. They should have done this 10 years ago, even 20 years ago, but finally they're actually engaging with this now. So they are late to the game, but FDA has already opened up this discussion to specifically educate consumers in this country on why they are not anti-GMO, why they are wanting to make sure this is heard clearly.
Right. So I think you can probably skip the next page because we've touched on the FDA situation. But yeah, so if you go to the next one, Susie, so this gets us in the FDA's activity around educating the population. I think this really gets us to this idea of communication and how our industry, the food industry, reacts to trends or reacts to information, or more specifically reacts to consumers' reaction to different issues, is as much part of the general issue we're talking about, GMOs and other unintended consequences that we've seen.
Yeah.
Because our industry, let's take GMOs for an example. I would argue that probably most of us in the industry understand GMOs significantly more than the average consumer. And the industry understands what the pros and cons are with regard to GMOs as an ingredient and what they have to offer, what, if there are any limitations. But our industry reacts to consumers' reactions. And so our industry, and I'm speaking very broadly here, began to limit GMOs or embrace the labeling that there are no GMOs. And by doing so, our industry has tacitly suggested to consumers that you are right. GMOs are bad. And so we are now doing the right thing.
Yeah, we've created consequences because we're trying to appease ignorance on consumers' part. Instead of educating, which is now what the FDA is finally getting around to, we're appeasing them when there is no danger to begin with. There wasn't a problem to begin with, but now we've assured them, you're right, you know what, it is a problem. We're going to take it out of our products. We're going to make sure we label so you feel safe. So you're basically agreeing with them that there's a problem when really we know better. We know better. We know the science. We know better than to do that. But this has happened, you and I have talked about, maybe with countless, it happened with gluten-free. Everybody jumped on gluten-free, and you're talking about 1% of the population, it's a medical condition. Gluten-free is not for anybody else. It caused a whole trend to be born when there was no actual basis there was no medical basis for it. It just jumped on consumers' ignorance of it and what the diet is for. And a lot of products, I mean, the good news is a lot of good products got created for this small percentage of the population that needed it. But it also created a fear that went worldwide over something that was not to be fearful.
So if you take gluten-free as an example, we're just using it as an example, not trying to, beat up on anybody who's engaging in that, but let's just take that as an example, right? So to Susie's point, I believe it is 1 to 2% of the population is diagnosed as celiac, right? And there are questions about gluten sensitivity. We're not going to get into the ins and outs of whether or not that is. But then let's add in gluten sensitivity, and let's say that maybe that raises that percentage to potentially 6, 7, 8%.
No. Actually, gluten sensitivity is even less. It's only 0.7%. Okay.
All right. So let me just be generous, and we'll raise that to 5% just to give everybody the benefit of the doubt. But here's the thing. So keeping that in mind, we had this question about gluten-free, and then you had consumers who were saying, well, gluten is bad no matter what, and they started promoting a gluten-free lifestyle, whether or not you actually, or specifically when you were not celiac. So then you had companies and grain companies who started offering gluten-free products. So grain companies who had been obviously in the business of gluten, not specifically, but as a key element, started essentially creating gluten-free, which again tacitly suggests that in fact gluten is not good and you need an alternative that doesn't have it. So now at this point, the last data that I saw, and this was a couple of months ago, we now have 1/3 of the population who are engaging in gluten-free behavior to some degree or another. Not to say that they're all aggressively gluten-free, but they're engaging in gluten-free diets to some degree. And the question then has to be, would we be at 1/3 of the population now if the industry hadn't, again, sort of jumped on this as a trend, understandably, but jumped on it as a trend and then started promoting it? Did that act of promoting it help to then create what became a larger trend than it would have been if the industry hadn't kind of sat back? And, it becomes a tricky issue, right? We're not here to educate. Our primary role is not to educate, but at the same time, do we start jumping on trends for short-term benefits versus thinking a bit more about long-term and what long-term strategies are?
And also you have to be really careful with survey work and behavioral research when we cross-analyze it. What's interesting around like GMO and even gluten-free and other topics, if a survey asks the question of the consumer, if it's phrased, are you actively trying to, cut out GMOs, or are you worried about GMOs? Or if they phrase, you'll get a huge hit on that survey question. Oh, absolutely. Of course we are. Yes, we are concerned. But Other research is if you just say in the survey, what items are of concern to you in your diet? They don't mention gluten-free. They don't mention GMO. I mean, very, very few, less than 2% mention that's what they're worried about. What consumers will say is, oh, sugar, salt, fat in my diet. That's what they mention. It is not top of mind. Gluten-free and GMO, it's not top of mind unless industry is pushing it in their face. Then suddenly it becomes top of mind. But otherwise, on their own, if you question them, they don't think of these. It's not top of mind. And so again, it's like, did we just sway them into worrying about GMO when it's really not a concern? And if you were worried, instead of educating them on why a product is GMO, whatever weather condition it helps, or it's higher in vitamin A, or whatever the benefit is to that, why it was created, are you just feeding misinformation? Are you just kind of supporting ignorance around it? By, oh, consumers want it, we must provide it. And also, industry can cannibalize itself, right? Grain industry starts producing gluten-free, you're cannibalizing yourself. You're not promoting your own products. So GMO, if there's a benefit, I would talk about the benefit of the product, not touting that it's GMO. You know, you focus on the whatever the benefit is of the product. Consumers right now don't want anything villainized. They're done with villainization. They want to know, in every survey you read, they want to know, well, what is the benefit? That's what I'm really interested in. What's the positive thing? That's what I'm really interested in the product. That's what I would be focused on, not whether something is GMO or not.
Right. And I see there's a comment about people having the right to put what they want in their body. And we're definitely not arguing that they don't have that right. And companies have the right to decide that, you know, that they want to offer both, you know, gluten-free and non-gluten-free. I mean, look, all of this comes down to choice. And we're talking about it from the industry's point of view, from a manufacturer and operator. And I guess what I would encourage operators, and I guess maybe at the heart of this conversation in particular, it's that I think that companies, manufacturers and operators should feel confident if they know that they have the right information, that they've educated themselves, that they know what the positives and negatives are, and that they have taken a position internally on where they stand on whether it's GMO, gluten-free, whatever it ends up being, that they feel comfortably putting a flag in the sand and saying, you know, we understand that there are concerns, but we have done our research. We think that this is the right way to move forward, and that's what we're going to do. Rather than, I think what's happened is our industry has become so influenced by data points that, to Susie's point, can be swayed based on the way you ask the question, the time that you're asking it, you know, the context of the broader survey, can be taken out of context or can overread or underread a situation. And I think we're beginning to make decisions that are based on short-term gains, but not necessarily informed long-term strategic decisions.
Yeah.
And then there's a lot of resources put against short-term ROI that may or may not match expectations, but then end up having long-term challenges, because if a company offers gluten-free and then decides to take it away, you're kind of faced with a whole other set of issues. Or if you had non-GMO on your packaging and then you take that away, does that seem like you have now abandoned a position, right? So I think what we're saying is, if you know as an industry individual that you've done your due diligence and you know, in this case, the GMOs are positive, that they are healthier, that they're allowing you to offer better benefits, I would say feel comfortable to plant that flag in the sand. Because often, and there was a comment about activists making a lot of noise, I think that that is often what happens, that it's a small group of people who may or may not be well informed about an issue, who create a lot of noise that's then picked up by a fair share of the media wanting to capitalize on a controversial issue. But it's rarely the vast majority of the market where arguably you will make far more money and have a greater return on investment.
Yeah,
Susie, would you say that's fair?
yeah, and if you are, if you're a company that leans towards organic, absolutely plant the flag there, but don't set up the victim, villain, hero scenario and say eat organic because GMO is bad. Focus on why organic's good. That's what you need to focus on. You don't need a villain on the other side to sway people to eat organic. And that's kind of for some of these groups, that's what's happened. And if you do have GMO products, again, it's not that you have to stand up and say, this is GMO, it's the best thing ever. It's what are the attributes that are the positive things, why it is GMO. Do you know what I mean? Like, you're not take the organic and the GMO, stop pitting them against each other, and don't let the word be the hero, the product's the hero, right? You're just the guide helping consumers pick whatever product's best for them, right? But it's they don't want victimization anymore of any kind of food products. Every survey is showing that. And it's really take them apart from each other. Organic and GMO, take them apart from each other. Don't set them up as that victim, villain, hero scenario for consumers. Take that out of the conversation. Organic, let it be its own hero. Let GMO be its own hero. But
Hey,
don't.
Susie.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to make sure you knew we had a couple comments in the chat, not necessarily questions, but just maybe some comments I wanted you guys to be able to look over before our time.
And so we've been trying to keep on top of some of them. And actually, yes, so there's one comment I did want to mention, but before I do, Susie brings up a good point, and I would add to what Susie just said about the hero versus villain. If you set up a villain and then suddenly the villain goes away, you have to worry that now suddenly your market position has been all but eliminated, and you have to essentially now create a new position. Anytime you set yourself up against a villain, and that's true in politics, that's true in anything. If a villain goes away, now suddenly you have to figure out what your reason for being in the market or what your position is. And it becomes very dicey. Whereas if you are simply focusing on yourself, your products, your services, what you have to offer, why it is what it is, and why it's, the best that you think is on the market, then whether or not villains come or go, your position is defensible, it is ownable, and it is constant. But there's a comment about Monsanto, and I wouldn't necessarily, I'm not going to go into the Monsanto issue in particular, but I will agree that part of what happened with GMOs are potentially an enormous solution for a huge share of the world's population. They offer benefits to gigantic swaths of people. But I think the comment about Monsanto is fair, that there were some companies that created GMOs that were solely beneficial to themselves, that only worked with a certain fertilizer, only worked with a certain, they weren't the majority of GMOs, but they certainly got an enormous amount of press. And I do think that's partially why GMOs have been villainized, is when anything is only going to benefit the few, then they become a villain. I mean, that's essentially how that ends up working. So I think if the conversation around GMOs starts focusing more on the benefits to the many, rather than the few products that were benefiting only the few or only the one, then I think, hopefully there will be a bit of a shift in the conversation.
Yeah, and one of the comments is industry delivers what consumers want, which is true, which was what we're saying needs to potentially change. If consumers want something that is based off of ignorance and fear, why would you feed into that? That's where the education needs to come in to play with some of these things that have gone forward in a longer lasting trend than they were warranted to be, or something's villainized where it wasn't warranted to be. So at what point do you decide to just blindly deliver what consumers want when it's not based on fact? It's not based on science.
And to build on that, if our industry continues to do nothing more than to chase these types of trends, right? There are trends that are macro, driven by innate shifts in behavior, new information that provides greater insights into how we should be behaving that then create fundamental changes in our behavior, that makes perfect sense. But as our industry tries more and more to chase what are arguably more fads or trends that are not part of a macro fundamental shift, but are really just fleeting, momentary, blips in interest, we're going to be wasting a lot of resources and a lot of efforts for minimal payback in the end.
And you're going to have to undo damage later that industry potentially helped cause by chasing something that's not based in science or was based on fear. So you have to undo a lot of damage at the end.
So, we're at our half hour. I think, Susie, if you go to the next slide, many of you have our contact information, but just in case you need it. But again, these are really just to get you thinking. This is not to change your mind. This is not to tell you exactly what to do. All of you on this phone will make your own decisions, informed decisions based on what's best for your organization, based on your long-term strategy, hopefully. But it is just to get you thinking, just to get you talking internally, talking externally, and thinking about different issues that are impacting us more than anything else. But I think we're happy to stay on the phone if anybody has questions, if you want to voice them, if you want to write things in the chat. I think we may have touched on most of what's in the chat, but if there's anything that's burning, now's the time.
Yeah, I'm going to stop recording, but yeah, we will stay on.